The 20th century in the United States and around the world was a time of change and people standing up for themselves. After the war, people were happy to be joined with their families again, and they wanted things to go back to the way they used to be. There were many counterculture movements because people felt like even though they were different, they should be treated equally. African Americans felt that they were being treated unequally and they were ready for change, so they decided to have Martin Luther King Jr. to lead the civil rights movement, and they used nonviolent protesting to finally get the right to vote. They marched and they sang the gift they wanted. Their most famous march was from Selma to Montgomery. Here, the police met them, and they were chased backwards, being beaten along the way. There were news crews that filmed the whole thing, which helped African Americans because that's how they got the world to see what they were going through and how they were being treated unfairly. Many people died along the way. Martin Luther King gave speeches, including his most famous, "I Have a Dream" speech. All of these nonviolent ways helped them earn the right to vote. Unfortunately, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. Lyndon B. Johnson and John F. Kennedy created new economic opportunities and instilled new programs to benefit the American people. These programs included Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare was for senior citizens. Medicaid was for people who couldn't afford health insurance. There was also the Economic Opportunity Act and programs such as Head Start. The Civil Rights Movement inspired other minorities to fight for their rights to be considered equal, and many of these were inspired by the African American Civil Rights Movement. One of the biggest counterculture movements was the hippie movement. Most people know at least a bit about the hippies today. I know when I think of the hippies, I think of VW buses and tie-dye shirts. But now that I've learned about it, I can think about Haight-Ashbury, which is where most of the hippies lived. The Haight-Ashbury's elaborately detailed 19th century multi-story wooden houses became a haven for hippies during the 1960s due to the availability of cheap rooms and vacant properties for rent or sale in the district. Many people were afraid or disgusted by Haight-Ashbury because hippies weren't exactly the cleanliest of people, and their lives consisted of drugs and rock and roll. There were also many other movements, including the gay rights movement, the Latino worker rights movement, and the disabled rights movement. The African American Civil Rights Movement influenced them. They used nonviolent protests as well, and even though not all of them were successful, they got some of the things they wanted. The politics of America stayed conservative and tried to avoid counterculture because a politician such as Nixon wanted to still have control of the nation. During the conservative time, Reaganomics came along. Reagan believed in the trickle-down effect, which was that the money from the richest will travel down to the poorest. Also, Nixon was caught in the Watergate scandal. Republican presidents were elected and government spending on public programs were cut. Both Bushes engaged in wars and new anti-terrorism policies were instituted. The four Asian tigers consisted of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Their geography gave them a great advantage because they couldn't be invaded easily. They were mostly surrounded by water, and that made them easy countries to trade with. India wanted political independence and was led by Gandhi, who told the people of India to use civil disobedience to gain their freedom. This event was very similar to the majority of the social movements of the 20th century because they used civil disobedience. They had two religions fighting over land. It was the Muslims and the Hindu. They were fighting over Kashmir, and they did use violence. Pakistan was eventually separated into two different parts. One was East Pakistan, or Bangladesh, and the other was West Pakistan. They still continue to fight today, and the threat of nuclear bomb is used. If this happens, the future will be undeterminable. In China, Mao wanted to gain his power back, so he told the youth to revolt against adults. They made the Red Army, and many people carried red books. However, the college kids were tired of being oppressed, so they decided to stand up for themselves at Tiananmen Square. They wanted democracy. 3,000 troops came to kick them out. They used tanks, and this is how Tank Man came along. He was brave enough to stand in front of a tank, and when the tank tried to go around him, the guy moved too. He risked his life. Many students died that day, but just like the African American Civil Rights Movement, people had cameras, so the whole world got to see the violence being used. Tiananmen Square is not mentioned in China because it was such a sad day. Unfortunately, their social movement was not a success, and even today, it's still communist. In Africa, the people wanted racial equality. Some countries' leaders tried to encourage total African equality, and other leaders just tried to encourage equality in their country. Some countries did not cope well with the changes because of years of racial discrimination. South Africa has lived with mixing cultures of Europeans and natives who have fought with each other. There used to be an apartheid, which had unequal rights for whites and the native Africans. In result, anti-apartheid activists such as Nelson Mandela fought against this, much like Dr. King for the African Americans. Eventually, South Africa was able to achieve equality, but Mandela was sentenced to 27 years in prison because he was accused of sabotaging the government when things weren't fair. Luckily, he was set free and he became the first South African to be elected Prime Minister. Ghana won its independence and they were left in a devastated state. Their economy wasn't made for them. It was meant for trading. The natives really struggled and there was a lot of chaos because they couldn't run their government very well. Then along came Nkrumah. He was a freedom fighter and he tried to make Ghana a really nice place, but he got paranoid. He made Ghanaian constitution to allow only one powerful president. People got really mad at this and the military kicked him out of the country. Then there's Rwanda and Somalia. It's been a really poor region and they have seen too much violence. Warlords fight over their land and resources and they terrorize the people. Plus, their president is corrupted. There's a lot to improve. Efforts such as Operation Restore Hope have helped, but lost faith has hurt this region. They need to end corruption and violence before any change can happen. In Latin America, the people were fighting for political equality and were tired of dictators, so they began movements and used civil disobedience to gain political freedom. In Colombia, drug cartels influenced the drug business. They grow so powerful and rich that they can overthrow the government, and it inspires poor farmers to go into the drug business. The government has been fighting back. They elected a man named Alvaro Uribe, and he's improved the economy so much, and he helps fight off these drug lords. Some of the other countries are dealing with violence too, but not as much as Colombia. In the Middle East, there was a lot of fighting over Israel because Israelis and the Palestinians had different views on religion, so they were fighting because the Israelis wanted to show that they had the right to be there. They did sign a peace treaty, however, called the Camp David Accords. The leader of Egypt, Anwar al-Sadat, and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem, along with U.S. President Jimmy Carter, were all there at the signing. Sad to say, Anwar al-Sadat was assassinated because his people considered him a traitor. All of these social movements, whether they are successful or not, made this time a time of change. People realized that they were not being treated fairly, so they decided to do something about it, and they all changed history a lot.